So let's start with the history of the discount rate from 1982 to 2003 when it ended. Notice on the Fed graph to the right that the federal funds target rate is 9.5 and the discount rate is also 9.5, shown on the Fed graph to the right and on the limited reserves graph on the left. Notice that from October 1st through December 1st, both the federal funds target rate and the discount rate both moved down to 8.5. So which one happens first? Does the federal funds target rate change first, or does the discount rate change first? And the answer is the federal funds target range changes on a daily basis, where the discount rate is an administered rate through the FOMC. So the federal funds rate moves with the supply of reserves. So if the Fed purchases bonds from commercial banks, this increases the amount of excess reserves in banks, and banks can lend those excess reserves out. This has shifted the supply curve to the right, causing the federal funds rate to go down. And then what happens is the FOMC lowered the discount rate to 8.5%. So the first thing that changes is the federal funds rate. Notice here, as the federal funds target rate starts to climb, the discount rate remains the same. As it gets up to too large of a spread right here, this is a 137 basis point spread between the discount rate and the federal funds target rate. The FOMC then decides to raise the discount rate as the federal funds rate is going up. Let's take a look at what the limited reserves graph would look like on the left. When the federal funds target rate is 11.5 and the discount rate is only 9, which is a 2.5% difference between the two, or spread, or it's a 250 basis point spread. So let's look at the limited reserve graph to see what this looks like. Notice then, throughout this time period, as the federal funds target rate was going down, they would lower the discount rate. So on February 1st, 1987, let's see what happened on the limited reserves graph off to the left. Notice that the federal funds rate is 6%. So that means they were buying bonds to shift the supply of reserves off to the right, which is an increase in the excess reserves for banks to lend out. And the discount rate was lowered to 5.5%, or 50 basis points below the federal funds rate. This continued then. Notice that the federal funds target rate equaled or lied above the discount rate throughout this whole period of time of the 90s, all the way into 2000. And do you notice how that spread between the federal funds target rate, which sat above the discount rate, got a lot closer than during the 1980s? Until finally, at the beginning of January of 2003, the federal funds target rate had dropped to 1.25%. And the only way that happens is if the Fed is buying bonds in the open market. And so as they continue to buy bonds in the open market, this increased the amount of excess reserves, or the supply of reserves, getting the federal funds target rate down to 1.25%. And the discount rate down to 0.75, or 75 basis points. So the spread between the federal funds target rate and the discount rate was 50 basis points, 0.75 to 1.25. That's a 50 basis point difference. So let's drop the discount rate to 0.75 on the limited reserves graph. So we've just lowered the discount rate to 0.75 on the limited reserves graph. Notice now, watch this. On February 1st, 2003, notice that there is no longer a discount rate. It now became what was called the primary credit rate. So up at the top here, do you notice that the discount rate ended in January of 2003, and they changed that to what's called the primary credit rate, which will be shown in the next video.